Welcome to this rapid revision exam skills session looking at the Pearson Edexcel Paper 2 British Depth Study, question 1C, 1 or 2, which is known as the how far do you agree question. This is where you're going to have to back up an opinion about a given topic. It's worth 16 marks, which is the most on this section of the paper. We'll get an overview of paper 2 as a whole and then we'll dive into some examples. Let's get a bit of background about the Pearson Edexcel Paper 2. Traditionally this is split in two. One is a British depth study and the other is a European or wider world depth study. The topic that I teach is Anglo Saxon and Norman England circa 1060 to circa 1087 and the American West 1830 to 1895 for the wider world depth study. In the past these two have been provided with as separate booklets answered within the same exam. For the year 2022 only though, these exams have been split into two separate shorter exams, so just be mindful of that. Traditionally though, the total time for both papers is 1 hour and 45 minutes. You can half that in 2022 as they will be sat separately. Now let's have a look at the question. Firstly, let's consider the crucial instructions that go with this part of the paper. In the Anglo-Saxon and Norman England section, you have to answer question 1A, the describe two features question, and you have to answer question 1B, the explain question, but you get a choice of either question 1C1 or 1C2 in the 16-mark answer. Because this is the longest exam answer that you'll give in this part of the exam, you have got a choice so that you've got a better chance of actually being able to write in detail about the given topic. So let's have a look at the 2019 exam paper. What were the options that year? Question 1C1 is, the late arrival of the Danes was the main reason for the failure of the revolt of the Earls in 1075. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. Or, question 1C2, the main consequence of the Domesday Book was that it increased William's ability to raise money. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. Let's break it down. Both questions are 16-mark questions and both pose this. How far do you agree with the stated opinion? You've got to explain your answer. To give you a little bit of help though, both questions say that you may use the following in your answer and give a couple of stimulus points. However, you don't have to use those points, though it's often a good idea to do so because you know that they'll definitely be relevant. But it also says you must use information of your own. If you don't, you cannot get full marks. So decide now. If you had to sit this exam, which question would you choose? Make sure it's the one that you're most confident on. Once you've chosen, it's a good idea to jot down a quick plan of the examples that you're going to include and also note down how far you agree. Is it to a large extent, a small extent, a limited extent, a great deal? However you want to express this, you've got to make sure that you give that idea of an extent. And don't sit on the fence here. You cannot say I both agree and disagree because there you are not making a judgment. You cannot get all of the marks. For the purposes of this practice, we're going to do this one. The late arrival of the Danes was the main reason for the failure of the revolt of the Earls in 1075. If you're doing a different topic, remember that many of the same principles and the mark schemes are going to be identical. So even if the content and the knowledge isn't particularly helpful to you, perhaps some of the techniques will be. So a quick rundown of what you need to do. You choose one of these questions. I would recommend that you write a brief plan if this helps you. Decide how far you agree and be prepared to spend between 24 and 25 minutes on this answer. Hopefully with question 1A, you won't need the full 6 minutes that you could spend on that, so you'll have bought a bit of extra time for this really long answer. And remember, there's nothing stopping you doing the longest question first. Just make sure that you go back and finish the other ones later on. Let's consider the mark scheme for this question. Yes, I realise that this is all written in examiner's jargon, but we're going to have a look at some of the key differences so you can see the difference between a good answer at level 3 and a really good answer at level 4. I've left out levels 1 and 2 as we want to be aiming higher than that. In level 3 it says showing some analysis which is mainly directed at the conceptual focus of the question, that being that the late arrival of the Danes is the main reason that the revolt of the Earls failed. Compare that to level 4 though, which says an analytical explanation is given which is directed consistently at the focus of the question. In other words, you don't wander off in different directions and look at other things which aren't being posed by the question. In terms of knowledge, accurate and relevant information is included showing good knowledge in level 3, but this is taken a step further in level 4. accurate and relevant information being precisely selected to address the question. That means that you're not just choosing the right information and not making mistakes with your facts, but you're selecting the very best examples to back up your arguments, and you're showing a wide-ranging knowledge and understanding rather than just a good one. And then what about the judgment? Remember, you are being asked, how far do you agree? You will need to give an overall judgment for level 3, explaining how far you agree, with some justification and explanation. You've got to take that further with level 4 though. Right, this really is a bunch of jargon here, but basically this is what it means. Criteria for the required judgment are justified and applied in the process of reaching the overall judgment, means that you fully support what your judgment is, whatever it is, by considering all the different factors that affect it. So not just one aspect, but several. One thing to be aware of though, you can only get a maximum of 11 marks for level 3 answers that don't go beyond the aspects pointed out in those bullet points, which are the stimulus points. So you've got to include some of your own knowledge to access level 4. One last warning though, it is tempting to think that this question is all about your knowledge, and it really isn't. The target is your analysis and evaluation of second order concepts, and in the case of this question, that's causation, why things happen. Sometimes it might be significance or something else. Knowledge and understanding of features and characteristics is assessment objective 1. But look at the breakdown of marks. Assessment objective 2, your explanation of causation, is 10 out of the 16 marks, so you'll want to be constantly referring back to the question and explaining. AO1 is important, but it only carries 6 marks. So if you were to just describe as much as you know about the topic without well relating it to the question, it's not going to be so successful. The space to write your answer in the exam paper will look a little something like this. The first thing to make sure you do is you indicate that you're answering the correct question. While it might be obvious, you don't want to leave this to chance, so make sure that you put a little check or a tick through the box to show that you're answering, in this case, question C1. I often encourage my students to use a paragraph structured like this. Make your point, give it a supporting example, explain its importance or effects, link it back to the question, which in this case is how far you agree that the failure of the revolt of the Earls is explained by the late arrival of the Danes. But also you can add on to your link an evaluation if necessary. With the evaluation, you might be giving a counter-argument that you actually disagree with. So when you evaluate it, you link it back to your argument. Do you agree with that point of view or not? That's how you not only link it back to the question, but you also show that you can balance an answer without weakening your own argument. I'll demonstrate that within this paragraph. After all, I've got a degree in history, so I should be pretty good at this stuff. But I'm not trying to write these paragraphs at degree level. I'm trying to write them in a realistic way for a good GCSE answer. So it's not perfect, but it should be good enough. Firstly, my point. In some ways, the late arrival of the Danes was a crucial reason why the revolt of the Earls failed. A crucial part of the Earls' plan was to unite their armies to provide a credible resistance to William's forces. To do this, they were relying on William being slow to respond as he was in Normandy, and for William's forces to be divided, facing the armies of the Earls in the west and the Midlands, and the armies of King Sweyn in the east and south. However, the late arrival of the Danes and Lanfranc's swift response as regent ruined this plan, as Lanfranc, Odo and others were able to concentrate on preventing the Earls from joining forces without the distraction of the Danes. This led to the failure of the revolt because Lanfranc was able to weaken the Earls' chances of winning before a threat from Denmark could materialise, giving William time to organise his response and deal with the Earls. So far, in respect to the mark scheme, I have kept this pretty much to the point. I've also included some of my own knowledge as well as using some of the stimulus points. So far so good. But I've not really fully explained whether or not I agree with this point. Here comes my evaluation. However, Lanfranc would have been unable to respond so quickly without Waltheof warning him. Without this, the Danes' delay may have been less vital, meaning I do not agree that the late arrival of the Danes was most important. And there, I'm relating it directly back to that issue of how far do I agree. So where are the marks coming from? There's a bit of AO2 explanation here where I actually look at the potential issue that the revolt of the Earls did fail because of the late arrival of the Danes, saying it was important in some ways. There's a mixture of AO1 and AO2 in the next bit, as I'm using both some of my own knowledge, the stimulus points, and explaining how it led to the result that the Earls failed. Same again in the next paragraph. And it's largely AO2 in the link sentence. This shows that I'm relating it back to why the revolt of the Earls failed. But the really crucial bit here is that evaluation, where I strongly state whether I agree or disagree with this, and I've really given my opinion. How far do I agree? Let's have another look at another example, remembering that we should be checking which question we are answering. Other factors were also important in explaining why the revolt of the Earls failed, for examples of the actions of Wulfiof. Okay, so I'm bringing in some other arguments here, some other examples, rather than just focusing purely on what the question has put about the failure being down to the late arrival of the Danes. Wulfiof was the last Anglo-Saxon earl who held Northumbria. He had rebelled against William before, but been pardoned. This might explain why he decided to betray the rebellion to Lanfranc, who was acting as William's regent at this time. As a result of this warning, Lanfranc was able to organise a timely response to the rebellion, meaning that it was virtually defeated before William got back to England to take command. By the time the Danes arrived, they could see that the rebellion had failed, and so simply raided the coast and returned to Denmark. This led to the failure of the revolt because, as regent, Lanfranc was able to exercise many of the powers of the king, and therefore defeat the rebellion quickly. Have I related this to how far I agree yet? Not yet, but here goes. This makes me disagree that the late arrival of the Danes was the most important, as the poor coordination of the Earls was even more undermined by Wulfioff's betrayal, meaning that the rebellion was effectively defeated before the Danes' arrival, and that had they been on time, it would have not changed this. So I get some AO2 for explaining the other side of the story. I get AO1 and AO2 marks for knowledge and explanation for the next sections, where I'm including both some knowledge from the stimulus points and my own knowledge. And I've related that back to why the revolt failed. But most importantly, I've said whether I agree or disagree. So how far do I agree? Looks like I'm disagreeing so far. So far, I've given a fairly balanced answer. I've given some reasons why the late arrival of the Danes is important in some ways in explaining the failure of the revolt. But I've suggested some other reasons why the revolt failed. And I've been clear about whether or not I agree with those points. So I've been answering the question consistently, but it's time to really nail down what my opinion is here, with a conclusion. Overall, I disagree to a large extent that the late arrival of the Danes was the most important reason for the failure of the revolt of the Earls in 1075. Notice that I've put to a large extent, so I'm giving a sense of how far, just as the question asked me. This was only one reason why the revolt failed. The unrealistic aims of the Earls to divide the rule of England between them, a lack of Anglo-Saxon support, and Wulfioff's betrayal all contributed too. This enabled Lanfranc to respond to the rebellion quickly, which made the late arrival of the Danes less relevant, as the rebellion was already well on its way to defeat even before they were due to arrive and divide the forces loyal to William. Therefore, other factors such as Lanfranc's leadership and Wulfioff's betrayal of the plot are more important. Had the Danes arrived on time, it is unlikely it would have altered the outcome of the rebellion, as it had little bearing on how poorly supported the rebellious Earls were, nor how well organised William and Lanfranc's response was. There we go, that's my conclusion, and I've been clear about how far I agree, and I've supported it, hopefully fairly fully. Again, this is not necessarily a perfect answer, and it would be good to get some extra detail in there, but we haven't got all day with these rapid revision videos, so instead I'm just trying to show you some techniques that might be useful. But in that first part of the conclusion, I'm addressing the question directly and explaining for AO2. I'm providing some supporting knowledge, doing a bit of both in this latter bit here, linking it back to this idea that actually the late arrival of the Danes isn't the most important in my view, and further evaluating that just to finish off. So I should have answered the question by now. But let's imagine I hadn't done quite so good a job with this. Let's consider what might be wrong with this paragraph. The revolt failed because William of Normandy was able to respond quickly to the revolt himself. The revolt was poorly planned, which led them to being easy to defeat. This was made worse by the fact that Wulfioff gave the plan away. After the revolt, Wulfioff was executed. This might be because he had rebelled before, and William had lost patience with him, even though he had in this case helped him. This means I agree and disagree equally that the late arrival of the Danes was most important, as it did make it harder for the Earls to win, but it wasn't the only reason. Alright, is there anything factually inaccurate within this? Not really, so that's not the issue. In fact, you would pick up some AO1 marks here for this point about the revolt being poorly planned, which leads to its downfall, and the fact that Wulfioff gave away the plan, again, which is relevant to its downfall. You might possibly get some AO2 marks for this, but I'm not really convinced. It might be up to the individual examiner, and let's face it, the mood that they're in on that particular day. You can't really say that you agree and disagree equally. That's not taking a position, and that is not really going to get you the marks for AO2. You've got to give a clear judgment, remember, in level 3 and level 4 if you're going to get good marks. This is not providing a clear judgment, and so I'd be pretty doubtful of getting those AO2 marks there really. However, this bit really isn't addressing the question directly. Nor is this bit. It might be true information, but it is not relevant to why the revolt failed. It just tells us a little bit of something about what happened afterwards. And this last bit I really don't like. You can't just agree and disagree and sit on the fence. You've got to take a side, even if it's only marginally. And if you think it's really close, you could always say to a limited extent, and it would still get you the marks. Here are some more Anglo-Saxon and Norman England, how far do you agree, explain your answer questions. When I've been through these, you could always pause the video here and have a go at some of them. William's preparations are the most important reason William won the Battle of Hastings, 16 marks. Stimulus points being the shield wall and Harold's leadership. Or what about this one? The lack of a legitimate heir was the most important reason there was a succession crisis in 1066. Harold Godwinson and the threat of invasion being your stimulus points. Castles were the most important way that William controlled England between 1066 and 1075. The harrying of the north and the feudal system being your stimulus points. And the Norman legal system increased the power of the king. The forest laws and Saxon laws being your stimulus points there. If you're one of my students, you'll want to pause it there because the next ones are relevant to other topics that we haven't been studying. However, if you're watching this for tips on general exam technique, there will follow some example questions on other topics. If you're studying King Richard and King John, here are some questions from previous papers. The loss of Normandy was the main consequence of England's involvement in fighting overseas in the years 1189 to 1204. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. Your stimulus points being the war against Philip II of France and Richard I's ransom. Or this one. King John's attempts to raise money were the main reason for the Barons' Rebellion of May to June 1215. Your stimulus points are taxes and the loss of land. You can pause the video here, have a go at those questions, or at the very least decide which of those two you would choose. But what if you're studying Henry VIII? Wolsey's failure to gain an annulment for Henry was the main reason why he fell from power in 1529. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. You may use the following in your answer: relations with Pope Clement VII and the nobility. Or what about this one? The main change for the English Church in the years 1534 to 40 was that it had to accept Henry as its head. Your stimulus points being the Act of Supremacy and the dissolution of the monasteries. Again, if you're doing this topic, you could pause it here, have a go at those questions, or at the very least choose which one you would do. And if you're studying Elizabethan England, the threat of invasion was Elizabeth's main problem when she became queen in 1558. Stimulus points, France, and Elizabeth's legitimacy. Or religion was the main cause of the revolt of the Northern Earls in 1569 to 70. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. The stimulus points are Catholic grievances and the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland. Decide which of these questions you would do, and if you want to, you could pause the video here and have a go. Remember what I referred to earlier in terms of the mark schemes. Some final points then. 16 mark how far do you agree questions require detailed knowledge, but mostly a strong and consistent argument. Remember there are 6 marks for your knowledge, but 10 marks for AO2, the explanation and analysis. You'll be provided with 2 stimulus points, which you may use, but you will need to include examples from your own knowledge too if you're going to get any more than 11 marks. You'll need to explain your opinion in terms of how far, to a large extent, to a limited extent. Do you disagree? Again, explain how far. If you've got an exam coming up, I want to wish you the very best of luck. I hope that this has been helpful to you, and if it has, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. If you've got any other questions or if you want anything else cleared up, you can always pop something down in the comments below and I'll see if I can give you some feedback that will help you. But other than that, I'll say thanks for watching and goodbye for now.